Hey there, old Lodgerinos. Are you ready for some tracksuits? I know you are. So let's get on track with another Better Call Saul basement breakdown. Here we go. Better Call Saul Season 6, Episode 4, Hit and Run. I'm going to talk a lot about twos in this breakdown. Pairs, dualities. There are so many of them to explore in Hit and Run. And I'm going to start with these two lovebirds who we meet in the cold open, not just because they're wearing tracksuits, but also because they prove to be downright fascinating. Their names are Mr. and Mrs. Rymans, according to the credits, and as this chipper little song makes clear, they are living their best life in what is evidently a well-worn, contented routine. The Rymans are an example of that magical phenomenon in Better Call Saul where the show makes something out of nothing, takes some obscure detail and weaves it into the fabric of the story in a way that enriches the show's main characters. The Rymans start out seeming like total throwaways, right? They're pretty mundane, which helps set up the reveal of their secret, that they share their home with a bunch of Gus Fring's goons. And they share it with Fring himself, as it turns out. The Rymans' happy home life is a front for Gus Fring's hidden secrets, right? They're intended to hide Gus, and they do. But for the viewer, the Rymans actually reveal Gus. Their behavior acts out an internal conflict that's hidden within Gus Fring. So while at first they do come off as throwaway characters, that's a fake out, as we know it has to be. This show is not in the habit of throwing anything away, right? And this cold open is a perfect example. There is not one wasted line of dialogue, not one wasted bit of on-screen motion in the Rymans' brief appearance. It all feeds in to a playful, nuanced picture of Gus Fring's inner life. You and me, a shady tree, the song goes as the Rymans bike past a couple of shady trees. You can tell by those trees and those jumpsuits and those color-coordinated bicycles and those synchronized swimming right turn signals that these two are a matched pair, an idealized state of being on Better Call Saul, that matched pair. And we see them living an ideal life until this red house shows up.
Oh, no.
Really?
Once they see that, it's all they can talk about, the red.
Use Adobe Red if you want red.
The specific shade of the red, the legality of the red, the intrusion of this red breaks the Ryman synchronicity. It introduces tension, a certain split between them. That split is visualized by the bicycle frame that divides the space between Mr. and Mrs. Rymans back at the garage. Here, she plots her strategy to eliminate the red, and he mostly shrugs it off and goes about his day.
I can put a bug in her ear.
Well, what can Barb do? That place isn't even in Mountain View.
It's not like they're at each other's throats, right? But the burning irritation that the red inspires is palpable. That red house is hot, isn't it? You can almost feel the heat. Because once they come inside, Mrs. Rymans' main objective is to cool down. Watch, the camera follows Mrs. Rymans. The surrounding characters essentially drift in and out of her frame. And what do we see her doing? We see her fanning herself, putting ice in a glass, pouring herself a glass of iced tea, and adjusting the thermostat as they're still talking about that red house all the while. Meanwhile, I'll call your attention to this tiny detail. There's also a bunch of guys with guns there. Did you notice? Hey, well, I'm here to point out the things you might have missed. The appearance in this homey kitchen of the paramilitary types, armed to the teeth. This one fellow going for the freezer seems to have murder dangling from every limb. That's the comedy moment that really sets this episode in motion. Because the question that hangs over the first couple minutes is, why do we care about this utterly boring Albuquerque couple? They hold us in suspense for a little while, but the presence of the Goon Squad begins to answer that question. By the end of the episode, we understand how the Rymans' perfect boringness actually makes them good at their job. Although they ignore each other for the most part, Mrs. Rymans does cross paths with the goons twice in this elegant little panorama sequence. Once, she has to swing her way around Mr. Guns and Ammo 1997 there as he puts his freshly filled ice cube tray in the freezer. Later, Captain Video over there asks her for some of that nice, cool iced tea.
Is that iced tea?
Would you like some?
Well, so.
And Mrs. Rymans is kind enough to get some. and she'll just fan herself off a little more on the way. Mrs. Ryman and the Fring troops have this much in common. They sure want to cool off. They're feeling the heat from outside. That's why they all want that iced tea so much. Then again, who wouldn't want iced tea on a day like this?
Want some? Nah, I'm good.
Oh, right. Old Mr. Ryman. He doesn't want the iced tea. Why not, Mr. Ryman? Why would he refuse a nice, cool iced tea after that workout? Well, I'm going to put a pin in that burning question because before I answer it, we need to fill in Gus's side of this storyline. The cold open concludes with this shot, as seen on one of Captain Video's monitors. This is the front door to Gus Fring's house, the same one we saw, for instance, during Walter White's abortive assassination attempt on Breaking Bad. One fun thing about this Better Call Saul episode is it shows us just how thoroughly overmatched Walter is that night he tries to get the jump on Gus.
Go home, Walter.
You're not expected to remember that obscure reference. The true reveal comes later when these establishing shots show us the geography of the Ryman residence and of number 1213. They're right next to each other. The camera work of the opening scene is very coy about concealing the Rymans' house number to preserve this tiny little revelation as the couple's association with Gus comes into focus. The information is doled out very carefully. The scene that follows as we track Gus across his changeover from public life to private life is a fittingly obsessive jewel of a scene in which the filmmakers use a character's interior space in a physical sense to describe his inner space in a personal sense. Gus enters the house. The light from the outside is totally blown out, and the effect is that Gus seems to be coming to us from a blinding field of pure light. This is the blinding public image of Gus Fring, upstanding businessman and solid citizen, the overwhelming display of light he uses to obscure his darker reality. You've heard me use similar language recently to describe Kim's approach to the world right now because both she and Gus share an appreciation for the power of a squeaky clean exterior. Gus closes this black door and the frame now seems to be bathed in shadow. In the same beat, Gus's smiling mask falls away. That's the central motif in this sequence. Gus travels from light to darkness, and as he does, we journey deeper into his truth. At this point in the scene, we're still seeing Chicken Man Gus, more or less. He's still wearing his Poyos uniform. He turns the TV on to CNBC. Even the magazine he brings in from the mail has an ad on the back that says, "Want more revenue-generating resources?" That little freeze-frame Easter egg obviously applies to the ever-expanding Poyos empire, but by the same token it applies to Gus's drug business, which, as we know from Breaking Bad, is about to experience a fateful opportunity to generate more revenue. The picture on the TV screen, the CNBC image there, is a statue of George Washington overlooking Wall Street. It's a striking composition with Washington's figure cut out of a sunlit backdrop. It seems to depict a dark-cloaked general looking over his empire. I see it operating in harmony with shots later in the scene of Gus, with his own dark outline cut out from the sunlit backdrop as he looks over the panopticon view of his own empire. Gus removes his Chicken Man shirt. This bright white bulletproof vest emerges, and then his costume switches to dark gray. Again, he's moving from light to dark, and in the midst of changing himself over to the darkness, Gus actually pauses to rest. You know, some people meditate, some people curl up with a good book, but when Gus Fring wants to relax, he treats himself to 15 seconds without a firearm strapped to his ankle. You find life's pleasures where you can. And we get to watch as Gus's internal supervisor shows up and orders Gus to strap back in. Stay alert. Stay on schedule. Down to the laundry room, again, from the light into the dark. The laundry room is hiding something. Of course it is. That's a very Gus Fring move. Hide your dirty work behind something clean. And what's cleaner than a place where you clean stuff? You can see how to Gus there's a certain perfect beauty to that idea. Thus, his drug lab is hidden under an industrial laundry, and the entrance to his safe house is hidden in the laundry room. For an instant, the frame is enveloped in black because now we're peeling back the final level of secrecy. It's so thrilling when Gus swings this door open, and we're so eager to understand what's behind that door. The slow pattern of the fluorescent lights extends that suspense by pulling our gaze deeper into the void. The animation of the shot spells out Gus's movement one more time from the light into the dark, spells it out visually. It feels like we have come such a long way from the blinding light of the front door as we enter the gloom of this tunnel. In the tunnel, Gus passes a guy who's dressed just like him. This loyal henchman is presumably going to live in Gus Fring's house for the evening. Most likely he's even going to do Gus's laundry to look the part, which somehow amuses me. Here, the show is drawing two subtle parallels between Gus and Lalo: tunnels and body doubles. At the end of Season 5, we saw Lalo retreat into a tunnel under duress, the bathtub tunnel, which just happened to be hidden under a place where you get clean. And of course, Lalo, like Gus, had his own double.
Muy guapo.
Good old Mateo with his perfect teeth, who we know served as Lalo's incinerated corpse at the assassination site.
It all checks out. Dental records, too.
These parallels do more than draw similarities between the two adversaries, they also heighten the tension. Because if Gus and Lalo are prone to the same tactics, that means Lalo understands how Gus thinks. That scares Gus. Lalo has had Gus pegged from the beginning, right? He knows who Gus is, but what he needs is the proof. Because, as a wise man in another storyline once said,
there's proving, and then there's knowing.
Proving and knowing are two different things. At the end of the tunnel, Gus pushes the door closed. Take note of the board games arranged at Gus's eye level, framed by his hands. Stir Crazy, Outburst. There's even a copy of Password visible on the same shelf. The names of the games, Stir Crazy, Password, Outburst, they form a little poem describing the psychological experience of life cooped up in this secret hideout. There's 2 copies of Outburst for good measure. That's how much Gus is ready to explode. And watch the physicality of this moment, too. Gus places both hands around the outburst and pushes in. It's a tangible and comical representation of Gus's internal discipline, like we're watching the scene inside his head as he pushes the rage back into place. I want to go upstairs to the rumpus room / nerve center, and here Gus and Mike have a disagreement about one of the thugs that Mike has planted in Gus's kitchen.
You told me that he had experience as a showrunner cook.
Mike maintains that the guy's burger flipping skills are beside the point, but Gus insists on Pollo's standards.
He's not up to Pollo's standards.
I'll find a replacement.
I love Giancarlo Esposito's delivery of this line, the snobbish reverence he has for Pollo's standards. It's funny, but at the same time, the underlying statement is serious, and I think Mike hears it, even if he doesn't welcome it. Gus is saying that the tactics to counter Lalo can't interfere with the smooth operations of the overall Fring empire. He considers the squeaky clean predictability of Pollo's to be essential. In fact, to Gus, it's especially crucial right now, because who would be more likely to notice and perhaps exploit some tiny aberration like a substandard fry cook than Lalo Salamanca, owner of the piercingest gaze this side of Santa Fe, and no slouch as a short-order cook himself.
Oh, hey!
Gus insists, don't provide the enemy any insights, any openings to exploit. And Mike concedes the point, but then he tries out another argument.
And?
All due respect, the rest of the world thinks the guy is dead.
Hey, maybe you don't need a guy in your kitchen keeping an eye out for Lalo, Mike says, because maybe Lalo's dead. And Gus shuts that right down as well.
Lalo Salamanca is alive.
A thematic point of emphasis in Season 6 is the difference between proof and knowing. Lalo knows who tried to kill him, but he can't yet prove it. Jimmy's colleagues know he's a friend of the cartel even if they don't have the proof, and they treat him accordingly. And Gus knows that Lalo is alive despite a total lack of tangible evidence. He's going on a read of Hector Salamanca's face here. In all 3 cases, people act on the basis of what they know, not what they can prove. Gus knows without proof that Lalo is actually alive, and this throws the instinctive fighter side of Gus into full alert.
There was a green Ford van. He was behind me for almost 3 blocks.
Anticipating his enemy's moves, probing for an advantage that'll get him one step ahead. itching to eliminate the threat. These two lines of dialogue, the one about the Pollo standards
He's not up to Pollo standards.
and the Lalo is alive,
Lalo Salamanca is alive.
capture a duality within Gus, the clockwork perfectionism and the paranoid fighter's instinct. Mike's feeling the strain of what he sees as competing impulses. He's telling Gus that it might be too difficult to sustain both the perfectionism and the paranoia. Perfectionism and paranoia, for lack of better terms, that duality is at the heart of the tension in the Gus storyline, and that's why the Rymans exist. They are those two sides of Gus personified. And just as Gus has to reckon with his well-grounded fears of the man in the red bandana, Mr. and Mrs. Ryman reckon with the terror of the neighbor with the red house. By way of this parallel, they become avatars for Gus Fring's internal dialogue. Mr. Ryman is the clockwork side of Gus, steady Eddie, calm, cool. Mrs. Ryman is paranoid Gus, anxious, brain in overdrive. Listen to Mrs. Ryman's language in the garage. There's such a nervous, itchy quality to all of it. The house is an eyesore.
What an eyesore.
She's going to talk to Barb, put a bug in her ear.
I can put a bug in her ear.
Oh, and remember those quaking aspens? That whole mess?
Remember when the Westlakes planted those quaking aspens? That whole mess?
Her body language is agitated too. She tugs her collar. She jabs one hand into another. When she talks about the quaking aspens, she seems like a quaking aspen herself as she scratches the helmet head out of her scalp. Mr. Ryman is the contrast. He doesn't think we need to get Barb involved. The key words in his vocabulary are more soothing.
What can Barb do? That place isn't even in Mountain View. It's Enchantment Hills over there.
Mountain View, Enchantment Hills. He just cools you right down. Look at the physical side of Mr. Ryman's performance. He spends the whole exchange in the garage calmly putting things in their proper place, the same way Pollo's standards Gus likes to do. Then, of course, there's these goofy calisthenics in the kitchen. Visually, Mr. Ryman becomes the clockwork man. The stiffness of the movement is the point. He's an automaton going through his standard predictable motions in unflappable fashion. It's an idealization that Gus Fring has of himself brought to life in this comical character.
Want some?
Nah, I'm good.
Why doesn't Mr. Ryman take the iced tea? Because he's not affected by the heat. He might sense it, but he doesn't react to it. He's the side of Gus that doesn't let you see him sweat. Mrs. Ryman sweats. She feels the threat, and she needs to eliminate it. Mr. Ryman is inclined to think that the red house is somewhere else. It's someone else's problem. But Mrs. Ryman believes the Crimson Menace is in their neighborhood. In fact, she knows it. She just can't prove it quite yet. So it is with Gus and Lalo. Lalo Salamanca is alive. You have to love how closely the language of suburban not-in-my-backyard busybodies can echo the anxieties of a besieged drug cartel kingpin. The script makes the most out of that conceit. The last thing I'll say about the Rymans is to admire the subtlety of them. They're in a little bit of conflict. The tension is real, but also you can tell they get along. You can tell this marriage works in the same way that Gus Fring works. Yeah, he's evil, but he's really effective because he has the patience and discipline to run a tight ship, and because he often can think one step ahead of his enemies. I appreciate the little detail that Mr. Ryman says he'll check into the neighborhood guidelines concerning the red house. He doesn't brush her off.
I'll double check the map after I shower.
He's going to find out the facts. In the same way, I think that the paranoid side of Gus Fring probes for uncertainties and then feeds them to this other side that methodically eliminates uncertainty. The Rymans don't just illustrate Fring's immediate conflict, they also show that this internal duality has a long-term strength, that Gus's mix of perfectionism and paranoia operates, for him, as a complementary pair. It's one of the most peculiar openings in the show's history, as far as I'm concerned, but also one of the most rewarding because there are so many meaningful intricacies woven through every frame. Watch it again and see what you see. From the two sides of Fring, let's go to another marquee pairing. It's the two Howards, starring in the great coffee shop hooker shove switcheroo. There's an irony running under this whole sequence, and that is that all the action takes place while Howard is sitting in therapy, and all the action also demonstrates why Jimmy could use some therapy of his own. But Howard's the one on the couch, and we see some of his dialogue with the therapist. The dialogue is primarily about what Howard doesn't say. He starts out talking business. He comes around to talking about his marriage, which is evidently stagnant and drifting. And the therapist asks, "Did you try the things we talked about?"
You tried what we discussed?
Yes. Yes, I did. But
And then he trails off. What Howard leaves unsaid, obviously, is that his wife didn't try, because what Howard can't voice is his fear that his wife doesn't feel their marriage is worth the effort. That's why he pivots to, "Oh, hey, let me tell you about my dream."
I did have a dream.
If you've ever been in therapy, you might recognize what Howard's doing here, which is running out the clock. He doesn't want to talk about his seemingly unsolvable marriage, so he'll blather about this inane dream, and before you know it, the hour is up. Howard's line, "I did have a dream," is followed by a cut to this blurry image of a very Howard-looking man carrying a traffic cone. It seems as if for a moment we're seeing Howard's dream, and slowly it dawns on us this isn't Howard's dream, it's Jimmy dressed up as Howard, which is, in a way, Jimmy's dream. Putting on the costume of Howard is wish fulfillment for him, the same way it was when he did it for the JMM billboard stunt all the way back in season 1. Dreams supposedly express the subconscious, and Jimmy has a subconscious desire to be Howard. Howard the winner. Howard a member of society's elite, and most crucially, Howard the trusted partner of Chuck McGill, the surrogate brother. The root of Jimmy's jealousy from the very beginning of this story has been sibling rivalry. Howard and Chuck were a brotherhood that worked, while Jimmy and Chuck, the actual brothers, were a doomed pairing.
But the truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me.
Howard hoped that after Chuck's death, Jimmy's jealousy might soften. Instead, for Jimmy, it only solidified. Which brings us to the stunt and hit and run. It's the ultimate act of a jealous man, to assume your rival's skin and destroy his name while wearing it. That, to me, is a telling distinction between the season 1 billboard stunt and this one. The billboard story is about Jimmy raising himself up to Howard's level, giving himself heights of status that he hadn't earned. That's why the whole climax plays out on the towering heights of the billboard, an elevation where Jimmy isn't entirely comfortable. In contrast, the scheme in Hit and Run is about Jimmy bringing Howard down to his level and lower, right? The crucial moment takes place down on the ground. Wendy's picking her things out of the gutter. There was something endearing about the billboard story, right? The way it ruffled the feathers of season 1 Howard, who we understood mostly as a huffy snob with a trademarked color named after himself.
Hamlindigo Blue constitutes a trademark brand identifier.
Whoa, back up. Hamlindigo Blue?
Yeah, Jimmy was trying to take shortcuts to the top, but at least he was working his way up, trying to make a name for himself, right? It was possible to reject his methods, but still admire his pluck, his good old American independent spirit. Kim certainly did, for example. But there's not much to admire in this hit and run heist. Now we're watching a Jimmy whose jealousy of Howard has been deepened by disappointment and twisted by grief. He's not trying to make something of himself anymore. He's looking to destroy. To accentuate Jimmy's sense of dizzy anticipation, we have this gorgeous shot that anchors the whole setup sequence in the parking lot. After Jimmy gets in the car and adjusts the audio system to his liking, Jimmy backs out of the space and the world seems to spin around him as we stay on this intimate close-up. Then we go from this intimate space to the wider space of the parking lot without a cut. Now the whole frame spins in this motion, right? It's such an elegant escalation of effect that results from the simple choice of placing the camera on the car door. Even the little jitters of the frame as Jimmy gets into and out of the car help convey the anxiety of the moment. I just love the cinematographic choice here. The swirl of red roses on Kim's shirt hint that she's feeling the same blood-pulsing thrill as Jimmy, that wine and roses type thrill. At first she seems to be positioning her ponytail just so in the frame. And then she turns and we see what I like to call those dagger earrings. Kim means business when she puts those on, right? I'd say she means business, and typically she has a secret when she has those dagger earrings on. Then we get the pictures of the chair leg and the tip of her high heel tapping nervously. Again, all these sharp, pointed, focused objects on the screen to reflect the way that Kim directs her nerves toward precision and focus. And we naturally compare this to the strained, shambolic movement of Jimmy as he rushes to play his part in this little drama. There's sort of a joke, intended or not, in this short sequence where we watch Kim preparing the space, as we see Kim check the sight lines to the intersection and even arrange the menus so they point along that axis. We intuitively understand that she's framing the action. But there's a couple things happening here. Kim is setting the scene to direct Cliff Maine's gaze. At the same time, stepping back to the production level, Ray Seahorn is the director of this episode, and with this shot, she is directing the viewer's gaze. The filmmaking and the story action overlap with each other. Kim's directional assessment of the space echoes the assessment that Ray Seahorn would have made from behind the camera. It's a playful little echo that projects out past the fourth wall. Let's also take a moment to appreciate the quick sequence of shots that concludes the cafe scene.
I don't know, it happened so fast.
Damn it, he owes me! What a rip-off! Damn you!
Here, Ray Seahorn conveys the essence of Season 6 Kim in these closing seconds of the scene. Because first we hear Kim saying,
I don't know, it happened so fast.
Gosh, mister, what did you see? Her tone of voice is so earnest, we almost believe her. But we don't, and because of that, we know what Kim's thinking as she drinks in Cliff Maine's horrified expression, and her face tightens just a little bit.
Damn you!
The smash cut to Jimmy with the jazz music blasting again essentially illustrates the joy that Kim's poker face manages to suppress. It's the outburst Kim can't allow herself to have in front of Cliff. Now Bob Odenkirk shares a scene with one of the unsung supporting characters of the season, which is this patience-only sign. This sign has perched conspicuously in the background of the scene the whole time, but after Jimmy parks the car, this shot here places the sign in the foreground, patience only. It's one of those moments of polysemy on Better Call Saul where one image offers more than one fruitful interpretation. First of all, if you read the sign out loud, patience only, there's a pun in there, sort of a sarcastic one, because this whole scheme is born from a total lack of patience. Impatience to get the Sandpiper money. Impatience to bring Howard Hamlin down a peg. It all has to happen now, right? And nothing can visualize that impatience more potently than Jimmy's all-out frenzy to yank this sign out of the ground before Howard comes around the corner. But the more literal irony of the sign is the more important one in my eyes, namely that as he wrenches this patience-only sign out of the ground, Jimmy looks like a freaking mental patient, right? His dysfunction is on full display. And the presence of this patience terminology basically invites us to conduct our own armchair psychoanalysis as we watch Jimmy spread his legs, wrench this shaft from the gravel, and then, still with the shaft between his legs, sweating, grunting, he plunges it down into the ground in front of Howard's car. This is a phallic image. It's about fucking Howard. Not about sex so much, that's not really what I'm saying, but about fucking him. And I'm sorry to be crass, but these are the base motivations at work and being displayed in the performance in this scene. This is a picture of Jimmy becoming his rival and fucking him at the same time, which, again, is the deepest fantasy of an insanely jealous man. A man who, as the scene's last comical flourish reminds us, is destined for a fall. In fact, Jimmy is well on his way to a fall, as we see at the courthouse. The color grading of this scene is quite cold. The atmosphere is positively Arctic, which fits the chilly reception that Jimmy suddenly receives from the officers of the law. One of Jimmy's lowest moments comes as the Beanie Babies clerk rejects his sad owl routine.
What is this?
A hearing change request form.
Jimmy's pathetic failure illustrates how much he has now lost. This clerk dates all the way back to the series premiere when she endures Jimmy's rant about supposed underpayment for a public defender case.
Before I do any more PD work for this shitty court. Sayonara, baby.
You have yourself a nice day.
In the next episode, a chastened Jimmy is back at her window with a cute and cuddly strategy to re-ingratiate himself.
What do you want?
Not to starve to death.
We're watching in that first season as Jimmy finds that his talent for observing human nature can still work for him on the right side of the law. There's a nice callback to this as well in Season 2 when Jimmy attempts the Beanie Baby routine again, but his minder from Davis and Maine, Aaron, cuts him off. By this point in his young career, Jimmy has a better grasp on the special sauce that he brings to the legal field, that finesse.
You submit the paperwork and you get a date, period.
What don't you understand about finessing?
And he realizes that a company car sort of firm like Davis and Maine will never appreciate his sort of finesse. Now in Hit and Run, as he approaches the clerk's window, Jimmy slams up against the limits of finesse. There is no bean-stuffed owl cute enough to overcome that dark stain on Jimmy's image. The darkness is part of him now, and the realm of the blue rejects him accordingly. The most crucial courthouse character in this scene is Bill Oakley. We come to him in a familiar setting as he pumps his quarters into the vending machine. In fact, the first shot with Bill is a distinctive close-up of the quarters, which just happen to have their heads toward the camera. I mention this because it's another fleeting yet conspicuous piece of George Washington iconography in this episode. They even had Peter Dyseth, the actor who plays Bill, I assume those are his fingers, grip the quarters from the very edge, so as not to obscure George's face. Meanwhile, on the other side of the law, Wendy's quarter lands heads down. Even George Washington does double duty in this episode, appearing in two different guises. In the context of Gus, the Washington statue on the TV reads as George the War General, George the Patriarch of Capital. It's an ominous and dark image. In the hands of Bill Oakley, 25-cent piece George, framed by the word liberty, is a brighter image. He's American President George, democratic system George, truth and justice. I don't get all that from the quarter alone, of course. I say it because this imagery of George Washington precedes a scene in which Bill's anger at Jimmy is rooted in his belief that this time Jimmy has not merely played the American justice system, but he has betrayed it.
But you scammed the court. You scammed the judge. And for what?
The courthouse stairwell is a familiar setting too, and by now the show's creative team knows how to use all of its angles and verticality to full effect. 3 pairs of shots illustrate the emotional drama and moral subtext of this scene. First, these matched shots of Bill and Jimmy. These shots put the two characters in different worlds. Jimmy is no longer a citizen of the realm where Bill operates, and the shot-making emphasizes that reality. Next, look at this pair of low close-ups where you can see the glow of sweat on Bill's face. It conveys the closeness and humanity of the confrontation. The editing contrasts distance with intimacy, because there is a relationship here. It's not just a professional dispute. Bill says to Jimmy,
I liked you better when you were just a regular bottom feeder.
Bill liked Jimmy. He said as much. Didn't love him, but on some level admired Jimmy's antics on behalf of his clients, and understood Jimmy as an adversary within a by-design adversarial justice system.
I understand advocating for your client. Deep in my heart, I get it.
Jimmy's latest doings went beyond checks and balances. It was just plain helping a murderer. That, to Bill, is operating outside the system, and therefore Jimmy's outside the system as well. Note the wording of Bill's line. You were just a regular bottom feeder. If Jimmy was at the bottom before, where is he now? The implication is that in Bill's eyes, the bottom has fallen out, and the scene's final pair of shots is about that contrast in status. The staging in the stairwell emphasizes that Jimmy is beneath Bill, beneath his contempt, beneath his respect. There is another witty little contrast tucked into this shot. I wonder if you noticed it already. The composition of this shot where Bill makes his exit matches the composition around Jimmy in this shot from earlier in the scene. That's the parallel. Now, where's the contrast? Look at the ceiling of the stairwell. In the shot of Jimmy, it's rotten and crumbling. In the shot of Bill, it's clean and unspoiled, like Bill's conscience. The attention to detail is borderline absurd to me. Like, functionally, this ceiling is the negative space of the composition, and it functions very well as such. It creates a compelling composition. Job well done. But that's not enough for this show, is it? Even the negative space itself is fashioned in such a way to create an additional layer of meaning. It's just ridiculously thoughtful filmmaking. Now, you might say, well, who's going to notice that Jimmy's ceiling is peeling and Bill's is pristine? But even if you don't notice the contrast in your explicit, conscious mind, it still affects the mood of the image on screen and shapes the way we perceive the characters. Jimmy's treatment by his courthouse buddies is pretty rough, but as Jimmy comes to understand, that same dark reputation that makes him a pariah at the courthouse is making him something of a folk hero to the underworld. The essential shot of the nail salon scene for me is this one after Jimmy enters. This wide shot, essentially a point of view shot, if not technically one. A rainbow of nail polish radiates out from Jimmy. The ragtag assembly forms another rainbow. They are literally colorful, bookended by figures in red and blue, but also colorful in terms of style, in terms of character. Plus the ornaments on the ceiling, the curtains, the fake fresco, the fish. The frame is full of color. It's a jarring shift from, just a few minutes ago, the monotonous and oppressive chill of the courthouse. We see rainbows in a character's frame when success seems just around the corner, when the world is full of potential. They're finally going to reach that pot of gold. And the way they're going to get there is with a new story. It takes a minute for Jimmy to realize what his new story is going to be, what it already is, in fact. But fortunately, old Jean's jacket is here to spell it out for Jimmy.
Then you're the guy, right? What guy's that? Salamanca's guy.
I'll conclude with a detail from the Kim and Mike scene. Here's a visually interesting shot that takes place during Kim and Mike's conversation. The aesthetics are pleasing enough. The foreground is blurred but discernible. It lends three-dimensional depth to the space. But now think about the frame two-dimensionally. The elements of the foreground, the window, the soda machine, the order wheel, create a smaller frame within the frame. Zoom in on that smaller frame. Who are the subjects of this shot? If you said Kim and Mike, partial credit. If you said Kim, Mike, and Gus, gold star, at least as far as I'm concerned, because to me, this apparent two-shot is actually a three-shot. We see this image as Kim asks Mike, "Who do you work for?"
And who do you work for?
The answer, as we know, is the chicken man. And what do you know? There's a chicken right there, looming over Mike's shoulder, spaced in the composition so that he's present as the silent third participant in this two-party exchange. Kim faces us. Mike and the rooster face her, bearing down on her. She's outnumbered, and she can sense the bigger forces at work here, hence her question to Mike, probing into that darkness she can feel behind him. The chicken returns at the end of the scene in poignant fashion. As Mike leaves, Kim recognizes him as the parking attendant, which only adds to her confusion.
You worked in the parking booth at the courthouse. You're the attendant.
Mike responds in characteristically simple terms.
I was.
I was. Past tense. Kim puts her hands up as if to ask the obvious question, and then what? The answer is that Mike walked through the chicken man's door and there was no turning back. So that is the visual as Mike exits the scene through the chicken door without turning back. And it's time for me to make my exit as well. Hey, thanks everybody for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you had a good time. I'll do my best not to make you wait so long for the next video, okay? Until then, Namas 3. Love you guys. So long for now.